Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. Malikia Young Puck dotting inside my chest, ladies and gentlemen. So as you guys do know, we still have the Aimchess, the Meltwater Aimchess going on right now. So I went ahead and picked a game between Wesley and Eric Hansen, the chess bra himself. I have not seen, this is an online event, but I haven't seen Eric Hansen or Daniel Naroditsky playing in any of these major tournaments. It pretty much, I mean, since I started my YouTube. So it's pretty interesting to, you know, to analyze a game with Eric Hansen in it and Daniel Naroditsky, which is going to be my next game that I analyze. So, as always, for my people in the Philippines, I will say mabuhay to you. Kamusta na aking mga kaibigan? Masaya akong makita kay muli. Hello, you lit? Maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video. Magandang umaga, magandang hapon. Appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. But if you guys are ready to go, let's take a look and see what we have for this game. So we got E4, E5. We see knight to F3. We got knight to C6. And this seems like it's bright. Okay, no? It's probably because of my hat, yeah. I haven't worn my hat since I changed my lighting, so it just looks kind of weird. Anyways, bishop comes to C4. We got bishop to C5. Castles by white. Knight to F6. We got D3 protecting the E4 pawn. D6, C3. So we do have the Juco piano, and it is a Juco pianissimo. So black goes A6. You know, they want to create a little bit of lift for their bishop. You know, because this knight isn't developed for white, you have the ability to play C3. But of course, I mean, as you guys can see, you don't have the ability to play C6 here. So, you know, you're more likely going to see A6 from black. And, you know, you see white already has kind of like their little retreat square for the bishop. So, you know, they're good to go. Rook comes to E1. We see castles by black. We got H3. You know, we don't want any bishop to G4 situations coming up. We got H6. Bishop comes back to B3. We see rook over to E8. We got knight B to D2. Bishop comes back to A7. We got knight to F1. So, you know, we have a couple options. You know, we can either play like the knight up here, the knight to G3. You know, develop the bishop and then encourage a trade and then move the knight here. See if maybe, you know, at some point you can plop into F5. You got all different kinds of options. We see bishop to E6. And then we have the bishop retreating to C2. And, I mean, it was legitimate to trade here. I mean, you're just going to be looking at bishop takes, rook takes. And it's actually pretty nice for white. So, I mean, you know, either or, you know, whatever you prefer. But like I said, bishop to C2. We see D5, pawn takes D5, queen takes D5. And then we have knight up to G3. Rook A to D8. We see queen to E2. Bishop comes back to C8. And then we do have the novelty of the game, which is knight to H4. And I mean, knight to H4 has definitely some logic behind it. I mean, you're looking at, you know, both of these knights are attacking this square. So as of right now, you know, black can't defend, you know, any threats and stuff like that that you have on this square because they're not double defending it. You know, you definitely don't want to play something like G6, of course, because you're going to be just giving away a pawn with bishop takes H6. Man, my arrows. Bishop takes H6. So we do see knight back to E7, preventing all of this from going on. Bishop comes to D2. And basically, I mean, both sides have done what they needed to do. You know, they got their rooks connected, you know, for white and for black. You know, white has all their pieces developed. Black does as well. So, I mean, both players, I mean, they're doing, like, you know, pretty good, you know, at this point. So we do have G5. Eric Hansen is basically saying, man, what is your knight doing on the rim? So he's like, move it. So he just puts it back on F3. You know, you can argue that you kind of created a little bit of a weakness in black's position, but I mean, it's not the end of the world. Knight comes to G6. We see queen down to F1. Knight comes to F4. And we don't want to tolerate that knight being on F4. It's just too nice of a piece. So bishop takes F4. And then pawn takes F4. Now, you know, the knight has to try to figure out where it's going to go. Knight comes to E4. We see knight takes E4. Pawn takes E4. And this is kicking the queen. So we just sidestep to C5. And now we have bishop to B3. And the thing I will say about the position, even though it's still fairly equal for either side, you know, something that you want to be paying attention to when you're playing your own games is if you notice this bishop has moved quite a number of times. So back at the beginning part of the game, you know, we saw the bishop coming to C4, and then we saw the bishop backing up to B3, and then we ultimately saw the bishop backing back up to C2, you know, when it was possible for a trade. And then now we do see, where was I at? we do see bishop coming back to b3. So there's been a lot of back and forth with the bishop. So it kind of does seem like, you know, there would have been kind of somewhere that the bishop could have lived permanently. But, you know, like I said, I mean, both sides are pretty equal. You know, it's not like one side is just completely winning over the other side. This move does make a lot of sense, but, you know, that's definitely something that, you know, you want to be paying attention to when you're playing the games. Like, you don't want to be moving pieces 3, 4, or 5 times, like, if it's not a great reason for you to be doing so. Not saying it's not here. You know, Wesley so knows what he's doing a little bit. So we do have king to g7. The pawn on f7 was pinned, so we're just sidestepping that pin. We got rook 8 to d1, and we see c6. We got queen up to e2. a5, knight comes to h4. We see b5. And at the moment, you know, this is a pretty big dream square for the knight to try to come to. But at the moment, this bishop is making it undesirable to come to that square. So, you know, we're thinking maybe in the future at some point. We see a3, queen comes back to e7, and then we do see queen to h5. And that was pretty much the reason for knight to h4 to begin with, to open up this diagonal for the queen. So this is a pretty nice, you know, setup with these two pieces. You know, dream case scenario, you know, we could try to get some situations open and the rooks can become involved. We do have a4, just knocks the bishop back to a2. Queen comes to f6. We see rook over to f1. Rook comes to f8, just making sure that we have f7 covered. Knight comes down to f3. Bishop comes back to b8. You know, black has actually held a pretty nice, you know, advantage. You know, it's slight, but I mean, it definitely is, you know, being played very well by the black side. So we got c4, and then we see rook takes d1, rook takes d1, and then we have bishop to e6. And you guys can see that black actually has a lot of pressure on white's position. You know, this pawn is kind of pinned a little bit because, you know, bishop is just hanging. And you definitely are threatening to take here. I mean, you just have your pieces maximized. And also something that is a little bit different, black does have this bishop pair. And I mean, it's a fairly open position. It's not completely, because you do kind of have this chunk of pawns, but you know, as far as the situation is concerned, I mean, it is a fairly open position. So the double bishops do kind of benefit you just a little bit. So we do see rook to a1. You know, we're anticipating at some point, you know, maybe there'd be a trade of bishops, and we don't want to hang our bishop at all. Rook comes over to d8. We see pawn takes b5. Bishop takes a2. Rook takes a2. We got rook down to d1 with check. King side steps up to h2. So that was another one of the importances of h3 early on. Pawn takes b5. We see knight over to h4. Now, because there are no light squared bishops on the board, this square is like very, very attractive for white. And it's going to be coming with a check. So, I mean, that's definitely something nice. Rook comes up to d2. We see rook to a1. Bishop comes to a7. And it was actually, there was actually a nice little variation that was possible in this position. And it pretty much talks about exactly something I was talking about in my previous video, about threatening checkmate and attacking undefended pieces. So when we're looking at the position here, there was a possibility to actually take on f2 with the rook. And what rook taking f2 does is automatically it's putting an attack on this g2 square and making it possible at some point. You know, you're anticipating, like I said, that knight is going to come to f5. So after the knight would come to f5 with check, the king would sidestep. And, you know, you would try to get something rolling with rook to d1, but you'd actually be looking at queen to g6. And like I said, this is taking advantage of the fact that this queen is undefended and also threatening to you know, get a checkmate. So, you know, you don't really have all that much time to try to get this rook, you know, involved in the game and checking and stuff like that. So that was actually a really nice variation that was available. But after rook to a1, we did see bishop to a7. You see rook over to c1. Bishop takes on f2 and knight takes knight to f5 with check. King side steps over to h7, and then you do see rook to c7. So, you know, the position is actually looking pretty nice for white. But if you do want to pause the video, there is a there is a only move in the position for black. And it's a really nice move. So if you want to go ahead and pause the video and find this move, go ahead and do so. Okay, so the move, like I said, it is an only move because literally all other moves just like completely lose because you are looking at this check coming on f7. So it's kind of a desperado move, but it's very tricky. And like I said, it's a really nice move that Eric Hansen finds. And the move is actually bishop to g3 with check. It might seem kind of stupid at first. You're like, man, wait a minute, dude. Like you can just take the bishop. Like the bishop isn't just like perfectly safe on g3, but in actuality it is. So even though it is kind of a desperado move, it's like a very resourceful, tricky move because you definitely have to make sure that you're playing like super accurate because of this move. So what Wesley So actually does in the game, and this is the best move to play, is actually king to h1. So if we back up, you know, you might be thinking, well, what happens if I just take it? Well, if you take the bishop with the knight, you're going to be looking at possible checkmate. I mean, you're going to be looking at checkmates. It just depends on, are you going to get checkmated quick or get checkmated slow? So if we actually take with the knight on g3, pawn would take on g3, and just to show you one possible scenario, king would take on g3, and then queen to f4 is just checkmate. This is like the quickest checkmate that you can receive, but I mean, you do have some other stuff, especially if you go here. I mean, the queen comes down. Like, I mean, you're getting you're getting messed up. Like, you know, there's just no doubt about that. This pawn is going to do a perfect job of like cutting off a bunch of squares and stuff like that. So, like I said, it kind of looked like, well, there's not a lot going on with bishop to g3 with check. There actually wasn't. So it was a really nice find. But like I said, king did come down to h1. Rook takes on b2. And just to show you guys like the difference between the two moves. Remember I was telling you yesterday, you know, sometimes like you have two different possibilities that seem like they're very similar. It might seem like king to g1 and king to h1 are pretty much like the same move, right? Like it's like, well, it doesn't matter either way. Well, actually, king to g1 is actually much worse than king to h1. And I'll show you guys exactly why. If we do go down king to g1, you'd actually be looking at queen to b6 check. Like there's two different ways you can do it. You can either like throw the check with rook to d1 first and then go ahead and take the rook, or you can do it. It's interchangeable how you want to do it. King coming down to g1. This actually allows, this actually is like somewhat of a mistake, like I said, because this rook is undefended. So when you're playing your games, like what you mainly, well not mainly, but like one of the big things you want to be looking for in your opponent's position is if they have an undefended piece. Also, you want to make for sure that in your own position, you don't have any undefended pieces yourself, because tactics abound when you have undefended pieces or when your opponent has undefended pieces. So, like I said, the queen would come to b6 with check. We got king over to h1. And the thing that you have to do throwing away, because you have to deflect the queen. And the way to do that is rook to d1 with check. Because if you do take the rook immediately, you're looking at checkmate. Like, so you don't want to just get mated. So you have to deflect the queen. Queen takes on d1, and then now you can take on c7. And, you know, basically black is just up an entire pawn. And they're just looking pretty good. So, you know, that is the major difference between those two moves. So, like I said, we did have king down to h1. Not allowing that, the rook took on b2. We see rook taking f7 with check. King comes up to h8. And, you know, you have to be pretty careful because this is back rank mating. Because this bishop is, you know, taking care of all of your flight squares. So you are looking at a back rank situation. So king sidestepping to g8 or h8 isn't that bad. Rook comes to d7, and then we see rook to b1 with check. Rook comes to d1 to block. Rook takes d1, queen takes d1. And then, you know, you have a couple different options. I mean, some of the best options in this position are actually like moving your queen somewhere. You know, you do have an extra pawn. But, I mean, the situation does look, I mean, pretty good for white. But we actually see b4 in the game. And like, I'll get to like why it's unfortunate that this is played right now in a minute. But basically what happens is we see b4. We got pawn takes b4, we got a3, and then we have queen to a1. And it is actually in this position that Eric Hansen does resign the game. And the main reason why is the fact that this queen is like really tied down to the defense of this pawn. Because you just absolutely cannot drop that pawn because you're going to be getting mated. So, I mean, you don't have the ability to like swing over and like try to like protect the pawn because, like I said, you're going to be looking at this. And I mean, that's just going to be mating. Like either one. Either king move is going to be mating. So, like, you know, it's you're basically your pawn over here on a3 is just on his own. So what ends up happening is you're just going to be up an entire pawn. And this bishop is kind of stuck. And, you know, once you take this pawn, I mean, you're just pushing this pawn up the board. Like, there's just nothing that's going to be stopping it from doing that. And you can also, if you want to, if you feel like it, you can go ahead and toss in this capture. And, I mean, you're good to go. So, I mean, it just isn't a position that you're able to play through as black. So that's how that ended up. So yeah, that was a really interesting game. I always like those games where both players have chances, and it just kind of like, it's just something that just kind of determines the game. And that's what it is. So I appreciate everybody very much for coming by. Maraming salamat aking mga kaibigan. I will say paalam and makita tayo mamaya, and I'll see everybody next time.